Welcome back. We're going to draw a cast of a mouth today. We're going to start by blocking in. Should we do it from the inside out or the outside in? I think we'll do it from the inside out. It'll be easier. So we're going to start with the line between the lips, which we've done a lot. And I'm going to put in a few construction lines just to help you see some of these relationships. So if we imagine a line that goes across, you see how the outside corners are a little higher than the rest of the mouth. So we're going to start with this little dip. We're going to go straight over to the left and straight over to the right. And then we're going to curve up a little to the outside corner. Draw this about as big as it looks on your screen, and make sure you leave enough room for it. We're going to be drawing the whole cast, so make sure you leave enough room for that. We could use a little fractional thinking. See, this unit with the curved portion is about a fifth of the line between the lips. You see that? So make sure that you've got about 1/5. And we can use the size of this unit to get us to a good approximation of this unit. The width of the bottom lip is a little bit wider than the width of this projection of the upper lip. So this unit is a little smaller than this unit. That's going to get us to the bottom lip. Let me erase a couple of these now. And we're going to work our way up. And this unit is about the same as this unit. You see how the typically upper lip is a little smaller than the bottom lip, so this unit and this unit are the same. I hope this sort of makes sense how I'm approaching this construction. The width of these peaks is just a little bit wider than the width of the depression under them. So if we come up here and here, that's going to give us the boundary of the philtrum, sort of like this. And then we're going to go down to the left and down to the right. And one way to calculate this angle is just to say we're just going to be aiming for points that are just a little bit past the corners of the mouth. So if I make these 2 points, that's going to give me my angle without worrying about measuring the angle. The more I teach this kind of fractional thinking, the more I'm convinced that this is the difference between people who, quote unquote, know how to draw and people who don't. Generally, people who draw well have just figured this out on their own, and people who, can't draw are people who haven't figured it out on their own. And that's because drawing is rarely taught this way. Now we're going to go, there's a little crease that kind of goes up at the ends and ends just past these points that we just found. And over here it's obscured by shadow, but that sort of gives us the basic framework of the upper lip. And it's occurring to me that this, I think I made a really basic error here, and I was not really measuring all the way to the bottom of the reflected light. I was sort of measuring to the core shadow. Everyone see what I'm talking about? That happens to my students a lot. You see that core shadow and it looks like that's where the shape ends, but you really need to look down all the way to the bottom of the reflected light. That's where the plane change is. So if we want to be honest about how deep this is, bottom of the reflected light is probably about here, which makes a considerably longer rectangle here. And now I'm going to think in terms of a curve. We could break this down into straight sections, but you see what happens if we just extend this to the corners of the mouth. We get a nice even arc. It's a really clean kind of radius, like the section of a circle. So we know where the boundary is, and we know where it starts and where it ends. So we can just try to draw a nice smooth arc. When you see an arc that's that clean, it's, usually it's more efficient to just draw it that way than the alternative, which would have been to try to break it down into straight lines. But what's the point when it's a nice clean radius like that? Okay. So now we've found this distance, and you'll notice that this distance is really just a little bigger. You see that? 1 unit, and this is about 1 1/4 units. So that's going to give us a way to get us down to here. We want, if this is 1, this is about 1 1/4. And how are we going to get up to here? We're always working from what we have already determined to what we don't know yet. So I'm going to say this entire distance here is about the same as this entire distance here. And I can check that by measuring, holding my pencil up and doing this kind of measuring. I would encourage you to do that yourselves. I'm checking my work, but they are indeed about the same. That's what I'm getting. So that was this distance here, and the measuring, if you're a little unclear on how it's done, you just extend your arm straight out, and so that the tip of your pencil is marking the top margin of what you're trying to measure. Your thumb marks the bottom margin like this, and then you can take that measurement and compare it to something else, and you can also use that method to duplicate a distance in your drawing. So see what I'm doing? There's that distance, and I'm going to bring it up here, and there's that distance. So we just found this. I usually don't talk to myself about every distance so thoroughly when I'm drawing, but I I mean, I do a lot of improvisation, but I'm really gonna just measure everything on this one so that everybody hopefully gets it right. So I'm even gonna measure this distance. I'm gonna say this is about 1/4 of this distance, right? So I know this, and this is gonna be about 1/4. And yeah, you don't want to draw like this all the time because frankly it's a little boring, but you want to have these techniques in your back pocket so that when you're stuck you can fall back on them. We're not going to measure the degree that this curves down because it's really tiny, so we're just going to make this dip down just a tiny bit as it moves to the left and to the right. And I'm going to make that line too long because we haven't measured where it ends yet. Okay, so now we're interested in finding where this happens. We've got these two little downturns here, and notice that these sides kind of angle in. So how am I going to get to that? I'm going to say this distance from here to here is about as wide as the lower lip. You see that? So if you measure the lower lip, it's like that, and this distance is about that wide. So I'm going to do it on the other side. Lower lip, that gets me to about here and here. And now I'm going to use an angle. This is only about, this angle is about maybe 5 degrees from absolutely vertical. So I'm going to just draw that angle as I see it, about 5 degrees. Oh, too shallow. That's about 5 degrees sloping that way, 5 degrees that way. And when we get to the top, we do that little perspective thing there and there. And here we have another pretty smooth arc. So we know where this bottom is. And notice if we go halfway through this space and out, that gets us to these two corners, here and here. You see what I just did? And then we can do a nice smooth arc that starts at this corner, hits here, and comes up to that corner. So now I'm going to use my eyes, and I can see that I've sort of screwed up my measuring a little bit because this whole shape looks too short in my drawing. I think I went wrong on the height of the philtrum, so that's not tragic. I'm just going to come up a little higher and make a quick correction, and assuming you've been following carefully, you're going to do the same. I don't know what I didn't measure right, but at a certain point you just have to use your eyes and say, whoops, that's a little off. that's the problem with measuring. You really, if you're going to measure, you have to do it probably a little more carefully than I was doing it, because it's easy to measure something a little wrong. And finally, this plane change does not go straight across. It goes straight to about here, and then it dips down towards the top of the philtrum, like that. Okay. I'll give you a minute to catch up with this basic construction, and then we'll start shadow mapping. So a big mistake that people often make is they pay a lot closer attention to the outlines of a shape than they pay to the shadow map. So we're going to really think hard about the forms of the shadow map. And I can see this dark coming up a little higher than I had it, like along here. So I'm going to move this, start erasing some of my construction lines. And the light ends right along here. The light ends. And these are exactly the same types of patterns that you would see on a living mouth. And by drawing a cast like this in different lights, you can really sort of get used to the sorts of things that you would expect to see in a real person. Then the shadow, this is still, see, this right here is still shadow. You see where I'm pointing here? It's filled with reflected light, so it's almost disappears, but that's still shadow. And then this is a clear shadow form right here in the corner. And here, remember, this was the line between the lips. Here we've got a cast shadow that's coming down past that line. And falling over it's curving because it's falling over the rounded form of the bottom lip. And here it intersects with another form shadow, which is doubling back and following the form of the bottom lip. And that ends up in here somewhere. And then it doubles back again and turns into another cast shadow, which zigzags down and finally hits another form shadow here. So this is that pattern that we see in turned forms. Form shadow, cast shadow, form shadow, cast shadow, form shadow. And very, very typical. Now we're going to look for any little pieces of light or shadow that we have missed. And so this light ends right about here. And there isn't any light on this whole side. The only other shadow is a small piece of shadow right here inside the philtrum. And that's that. Our next step is always going to be to do first shading, and remember, if you're right-handed, you're going to do it this way. If there's any construction lines that are interfering under your shadows, this is a good time to get rid of them. And I'm left-handed, so I'm going to shade the left-handed way. You're going to go the other direction, please, if you're right-handed. And this is something you should be getting good at by now, just laying in a nice even tone. And that tone we are basically, this is the most important thing to get right in shading anything, is figuring out where the light can reach and where it can't reach. Remembering that light bounces around off of other surfaces, so this boundary is only refers to direct light. There's going to be reflected light inside the shadows, and there's going to be areas in the light that are darker than others, the halftones, but there is a clear zone which receives direct light and a clear zone that doesn't, and our job is to separate those two zones away from each other. And a lot of people, and I forgot to shadow map the wall. I'm going to just do a real quick boundary there, and we're going to extend this shading onto the wall. So once you learn how to draw details, a lot of people just want to rush into all that beautiful detail shading and get those three-dimensional effects. It's always a bad idea to rush into that. You have to feel really good about how things are breaking down this is at this point a two-value study. And this is the time in the drawing where you really want to pause and try to read the forms in your drawing. And once you've done that first shading, you can look back and forth, as I'm now doing, between your drawing and the cast, and any imperfection is going to jump out at you in a way that it just couldn't when all you had to look at was outlines. So what I'm seeing is I still need to elevate this shadow edge a little bit. So look how easy it is to fine-tune this. It's really hard to fine-tune detail shading. It's really easy to fine-tune first shading. See what I just did? I just bumped that up a little, and I can bump up this back contour. So the drawing at this point is like putty. I can push and pull any of the shadow edges around until when I squint my eyes a little, the whole thing is reading clearly as it should in terms of two values. And I'm going to say I'm pretty satisfied with this, and I have to pace myself, so we're going to move on. Make one more little correction up here. So the next step in a shaded study is to look at where the form shadow edges are and erase the shadow map. So remember, the cash out edges are going to be sharper, so I don't need to erase those lines, but wherever I need to make a soft gradual edge, I'm erasing the shadow map. I don't always have to do that like in my own work, because if I'm not doing a demo, my shadow map's going to be really faint, and I'm probably not going to have to go back and erase it. But when I do a demo, I'm drawing, my mapping is a little darker, so, but that just takes a second. That's good. Okay, now the fun part comes finally. We're going to go in and try to account for one form at a time. And we're going to start again with the line between the lips. Clearest dark in this whole face is this dark here. So I'm going to darken this form where these two planes intersect. And notice it stays dark right to about here and right to about here. Now, this is pretty subtle, but if we zoom in here, we can see that what we have here is a very sharp edge along the top. And let me zoom in a little more. And along here, it's slightly softer. So what I'm going to do is shade away from this line, and I'm going to let the bottom margin of this shadow just be a little bit jaggedy, like that, to show that this is a medium sharp cast shadow edge, and this is an extremely sharp boundary between two surfaces. And we're going to continue over here the same way. And fading down a little. Now, I hope everyone's capable of seeing that right above this dark cast shadow edge is a reflected light. And here we're going to think about moving the pencil the way the form moves. So I'm going to be curving just a little bit slightly to the left, and I'm darkening through the center of this shadow. Not all the way to the bottom and not all the way to the top. That's where I see that core shadow. Everyone with me? You seeing what I'm seeing? And you see how this slight curvature of my line helps to show the way that form is curving. And we're not doing any smudging on these drawings. We're just trying to let our shading direction show the form. And this core shadow ends where this cast shadow ends, because that's where the form emerges into light, right here. And here's here's where a lot of beginners are gonna get thrown, because this form of the upper lip is, you see this boundary is visible, but our shadow edge was down here. So what's happening here? That is a halftone. So that is in the light. We can draw it, we can indicate it, but and we indicated this boundary before, but we're gonna go do it just so much lighter. We're barely touching the paper when we get above our shadow edge, like that. And in fact, I'm gonna darken this a little more just to show you never want your halftones to visually connect with your shadows. You have to keep them distinct. Now we're going to follow the shadow map, and as I hit the other side of the mouth, I'm curving my lines the other direction. Because now the mouth is to my right. This side of the mouth is to my right. And here, look what happens to our reflected light. It fades away because there's nothing for it to reflect off of. The reflected light here is coming off of this bright, intense light of the bottom lip. Over here, nothing. So we're just going to be shading this and we're seeing a slight darkening to the top of the form, but there's really not a clear plane, there's not a clear value change here. Okay, we're going to be looking for the same patterns in the lower lip. This is a little lighter here. It's probably getting a little bit of ambient light from the ceiling. This is a cast shadow edge, so it is on a cast shadow edge like this. I like to make it as sharp as I can make it without shading the direction of the edge. So I'm shading right up to that edge as tight as I can, but always shading into the edge. You see that? So that creates that just slight degree of fuzziness that we don't get, like here I'm shading with the edge. And you always want to be aware of when you're shading with the edge, when you're shading into the edge. Here, where it turns into form shadow, I'm going to shade into the edge, but I'm going to let every pencil mark trail over that edge a little and create even more fuzziness. And that's the basic shading technique that really key to master that. That's how to control the sharpness of your edges is like the second most important thing about shading. The first most important thing is shadow mapping. You've got to get your lights and darks in the right place. But the second most is your ability to control those edges. So this is a form shadow edge, and so I'm deliberately creating this softness. And let me explain what people tend to get wrong here and why. this edge that you see me shading right here, it's going to look sharper than it is to you because this is a very high contrast edge. But if we zoom in on it, you can see that it's actually a pretty gradual fade, especially when you compare it to like this. So the mistake that beginners make is when they see a high contrast edge, they just unthinkingly sharpen it. When they see a low contrast edge, they unthinkingly make it soft. And what we need to do instead is think about why we're seeing the edges we're seeing and sharpen them or soften them accordingly. Like this edge down here is a relatively low contrast but sharp edge because this is the boundary of the lower lip. So I'm going to shade with this edge. See what I'm doing? I'm sharpening this one, but it's very low contrast. This edge under here is a cast shadow edge. It's medium sharp, so I'm shading into it, but I'm shading pretty tight. And trust me, if you don't learn to think through this stuff, you're not gonna get it right. If you learn to think through it, you can actually spend a little less time looking hard at the motif because your hand is going to know what to do. And that's when drawing gets really easy and fun, when you eventually, some of these things become automatic. So one thing about cast shadow edges that we've talked about before is that as we get away from the source of the cast shadow, in this case the bottom lip, the shadow is going to get a little fuzzier and fuzzier as it gets down to here. I think that's pretty clear. But it's still not as fuzzy as this form shadow edge, which is very fuzzy. It's a very gradual turn there away from the light. So this is where most of the really interesting stuff is happening in this middle zone. That's where we find most of our reflected lights. If we can get this part right, the rest of the drawing will be pretty easy. It would be easy, if you weren't looking for it, you would most certainly miss the fact that along the whole margin of this bottom edge, there's a tiny reflected light because this is in fact turning away from the light gradually, and there's a little reflection coming from the ground underneath. So I'm going to darken this margin here and quickly throw in a really dark under here. And to get that form to turn, it's just a matter of just dropping in a little tiny core shadow above the edge to give a sense of that little tiny reflected light. And you'll see that what's happening here is the same thing that's happening here. It's just happening in miniature because it's a much smaller radius turn. And I'm just going to go ahead and darken all this. Notice I want this edge to be sharp, so I'm going to do some shading with the edge right where the edge happens, and then I'm going to transition to my first shading direction. It would also make sense to transition to a vertical direction to show this is on a wall. You could throw in some horizontal shading also. And you'll see the vertical shading direction is going to work well to sharpen the outside of the form. When you're trying to cover a big area like this, one technique that a lot of artists like to use and illustrators is if you're having trouble making long lines, you can just use a series of overlapping short lines. A lot of people find that's a little easier like that, because we're really just trying to, when you're trying to create an area this dark, you want to do, we're not really trying to explain this form, it's just a flat wall. So whatever way you find easiest to get a nice dark tone in there. And there's a logic behind me doing this now, which is getting my darkest dark in this cast shadow is going to enable me to make more intelligent decisions about how dark to go with the rest of the drawing. Because I'm establishing my my bottom note here. This is graphite. It's not charcoal, but the walls obviously, like especially right under here, that's the darkest part of the drawing. So having established my bottom note, it's going to really help a lot to determine like what we still have left to do here. So I'm going to zoom out. So this is a time to squint and look back and forth and just sort of say, okay, what's missing in my drawing? Where does that shadow side get the darkest? And interestingly, it gets the darkest on this plane, and that's because this plane is facing up. This is our main up plane, and remember, within shadows, your up planes tend to be the darkest. That's not true here. For some reason, this down plane of the upper lip in this lighting situation is reading a little darker than the up plane here. I'm not sure exactly where that light's coming from. So I'm going to go back to my first shading direction and just start organizing my darks inside this shadow. Here I've got another one of those soft transitions. But the big idea here is that this whole zone is, as it moves up, it gets really dark, almost as dark as the wall. this plane also, really pretty dark. And a sharp edge along here. But I think you can see that the wisdom of dropping that cast shadow in first is really helpful for determining how dark we still need to go with these remaining shadows. And because you'll notice that right here the forms are the clearest, and so that form shading is really important, curving the lines in a particular way. Through here, when you look at the cast, it's like kind of flattens out. There's just not enough light to make the form super clear, so we can get away without being really explicit with the form shading. We're just sort of, I keep coming back to my first shading direction, which again is going to go the other direction for most of you. And we're getting close to a point where we could call this drawing almost done, or we could work on it for another 12 hours and make it look like a photograph. But at this point, you'll see that I've pretty much explained the form. Like, you can look at my drawing and hopefully yours, and you start to see like the forms are accounted for. And that's usually about as far as I like to take a drawing. I'm just trying to tell the story of the forms in a way. I'm not trying to get photographically realized surfaces. But we have another 15 minutes or so to go, so we're going to take this a little further. But I think I'll take a little break first. At this point, also, like, I'm kind of dragging my hand through this drawing. Pretty bad practice, but it's creating a little bit of smudging. The flip side of that is it allows me I can erase some highlights back in. Some artists will intentionally take a rag and smudge a tone over the whole drawing to do the same thing. Or, of course, as we're going to do another day, you can do your whole study on gray paper and then use white for your highlights. Just going to throw a little halftone in here. I'm using my lightest pressure. If you have a hard time making lines this faint, just think back to the weakest handshake anyone ever gave you and try to hold the pencil with that kind of grip, like you're barely touching the pencil, and then you're going to have a very easy time making faint lines. That's called dynamic control. It's critically important that you learn to control how hard you're pushing. But as I always say, you don't have any nerve endings at the end of the pencil. You do have nerve endings in your fingers, so if you focus on how lightly you're gripping the pencil, your lines will just automatically be faint. You can't make a dark line if you're holding the pencil with a very, very weak grip. Okay, quick break. So class ended and this demo is over, but for the sake of the video, I'm just going to add a few more. I'm going to just organize these darks a little more. What I'm looking for is areas inside the main shadow where I see the darkest darks. And by bringing those out, I will essentially be also bringing out some of the subtler reflected lights that are happening inside that shadow shape. So I've got a very subtle extension of this core shadow that passes on to the rest of the lower lip, and also a little more clarity of this cast shadow that extends further over the boundary of the chin. But in here, where we might expect a fairly clear plane change, notice that it's very flat. So I'm not going to try to bring out any plane changes that I can't see. So we're going to leave that alone. And notice that in my drawing that this whole area is jumping out in front of the cast shadow a little too much. So in the same way that I sharpened this edge before, I'm now going to lower the intensity of the edge, I'm going to create a lower contrast edge by just shading over that whole zone. And it's important to understand that you can do this without sacrificing the sharpness of the edge. You see that? This edge remains just as sharp as it was before, but it's because those sharpening strokes are still there. I'm not obscuring them, but I am lowering the amount of contrast along the edge, and that's a stage that I think of as unifying the drawing. It's pulling us back towards the place we started, which was a two-value study. And that often happens where you let yourself pay really close attention for a while to the subtle value changes that happen throughout the drawing, and you realize you've pushed them a little too far, and the drawing can start to look kind of patchy. And the way to recover that unified sense of light and dark is to go back the same as you did in the first shading step and just pass a tone over everything and clean it up like that. because, once again, the most important thing to get right is the big organization of light and dark. And when those smaller details are useful to bring out the smaller forms, we definitely want to use them, but it can quickly get to the point where you're sacrificing the overall organization, and then it's time to pull things together again like that. You'll notice I don't even have my glasses on right now because the fact that things look a little out of focus to me is not a problem at this stage. In fact, it's probably an advantage because it's forcing me to see those big value changes. And with that, I would say this study is about done. One more thing is this interesting little darkening through the upper lip that makes just a slightly crisper boundary here. And you'll notice that this dark very slightly kind of bifurcates into two less focused darks that come together, and something like that. Okay, thanks as always for watching, and we'll see you next time.